You're standing in a narrow hallway in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The weather is bitter, February cold, 1740, the kind of colonial winter that kills unprepared travellers. You've been granted access to enter the sleep hall where the brothers live. The hallway is 4 feet wide. The ceiling is 6 feet high. The doorways force you to bow to enter. This is intentional. Everything here is designed to humble, to reduce, to break down the flesh and elevate the spirit. Inside the sleep hall, 15 wooden benches line the walls. Not beds, benches, 15 inches wide. No mattresses, no pillows, just bare wood. The brothers sleep sitting up, leaning against the wall, for 4 hours each night. Then they rise at midnight for prayers and hymns that last until 2 a.m. Then back to the benches for 2 more hours. Then up at 5 a.m. for morning worship. They do this every night, for years, for decades, some for their entire adult lives. Their backs never touch a horizontal surface. Their bodies never experience the comfort of lying down. Sleep becomes a form of suffering, a nightly crucifixion of the flesh. The brothers wear white robes, hoods cover their heads, they are celibate. Silent most of the day, they eat 1 meal, vegetables and bread. No meat, no alcohol, no coffee or tea. They work 12 hours daily, printing, farming, building, creating illuminated manuscripts so beautiful they are considered among the finest produced in colonial America, and they do all of this voluntarily. These are not prisoners, not slaves, not men forced into this life against their will. They chose it, left comfortable lives, abandoned families, gave up property and prospects, to sleep on wooden benches, to starve themselves, to live in silence and celibacy in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Why? What could possibly motivate intelligent people to embrace such extreme suffering? What belief system could be so compelling that it convinced hundreds of Germans to cross the Atlantic and build a monastery based on medieval mysticism in the middle of nowhere? This is the story of the Ephrata Cloister, the strangest, most radical religious experiment in colonial America, a community that combined German pietism, medieval mysticism, apocalyptic prophecy, and practices so extreme they shocked even other religious radicals. A movement that produced extraordinary art and music, that influenced American culture in ways rarely acknowledged, that collapsed spectacularly within decades of its founding. This is not a simple story about a weird cult. This is a window into the religious fever that gripped Europe and America in the 18th century, into beliefs and practices so foreign to modern sensibility that they seem incomprehensible, into a world where suffering was virtue, where the body was the enemy, where the only path to God required destroying everything that made you human. The Ephrata Cloister, 300 years ago in Pennsylvania. Let me show you how strange it really was. The story begins not in America, but in Germany. 1703. A young man named Conrad Beissel is born in Eberbach, a small town in the Palatinate region. His father is a baker. His mother dies when Conrad is 8. His father dies when he is 9. Conrad becomes an orphan, who is apprenticed to a baker, learning the trade, working long hours, living in poverty. But Conrad is different. Even as a child, he is obsessed with religion. Not the comfortable religion of the established church, radical religion, mystical religion. He reads the works of Jakob Böhme, a German mystic who wrote about inner light and divine wisdom. He studies the pietists who rejected formal religion for personal spiritual experience. He seeks something deeper than what the state church offers. The Palatinate in the early 18th century is devastated. War after war, French invasions, religious persecution, economic collapse. Thousands are fleeing to America. William Penn's colony of Pennsylvania promises religious freedom, land, opportunity, escape from European suffering. In 1720, at age 17, Conrad decides to emigrate. He joins thousands of Germans heading to Pennsylvania. The voyage is brutal. Weeks at sea, disease, starvation, many die. Conrad survives, arrives in Philadelphia, works as a baker. But he is not interested in making money or building a comfortable life. He is seeking spiritual truth. He joins the German Baptist Brethren, also called Dunkers because they practice full immersion baptism. The Brethren are radical. They refuse military service, reject oaths, practice foot washing, live simply. Conrad becomes part of their community in Germantown outside Philadelphia. But even the Brethren are not radical enough for Conrad. He begins developing his own theology, his own practices, ideas that disturb even other religious radicals. He becomes convinced that celibacy is superior to marriage, that the millennium is imminent, that God is calling him to establish a new community of the truly faithful. In 1732, Conrad moves to the frontier, to Lancaster County, dense forest, few settlements. He establishes a hermitage, lives alone in the wilderness, fasts, prays, meditates, seeks visions. He later claims to have experienced direct revelations from God during this period. Messages, instructions, a divine calling to create something new. Word spreads among German immigrants. A holy man living in the forest, a prophet receiving visions. People come to him, seeking guidance, seeking truth, seeking escape from the compromises and corruptions of ordinary religious life. By 1735, a small community is formed around Conrad. Men and women, mostly German immigrants. Mostly people who have tried other churches and found them lacking. People seeking radical commitment, total devotion, complete surrender to God. Conrad teaches them his theology. It is complex, drawn from multiple sources. German pietism provides the foundation, personal spiritual experience over institutional religion. But Conrad adds layers, medieval mysticism, Sabbatarian beliefs, apocalyptic expectations, extreme asceticism, and his own revelations which he claims come directly from God. Central to Conrad's teaching is the idea that the body is the enemy. The flesh is corrupt, sinful, an obstacle to spiritual growth. The only way to overcome the flesh is to punish it, deny it, starve it, deprive it of sleep and comfort and pleasure. Only by breaking the body can the spirit be freed. This leads to practices that seem insane to modern people. Sleeping on wooden benches, eating minimal food, working constantly, praying for hours, all designed to exhaust the body, to break its demands, to free the soul from physical constraints. Conrad also teaches that celibacy is essential. Marriage is a compromise with the flesh. Sex is corruption, even within marriage. The truly spiritual person remains celibate, conquers sexual desire, lives purely, without physical intimacy, without family bonds that distract from devotion to God. This teaching creates immediate controversy. Many of his followers are married, they have spouses, children. Conrad tells them to separate, to live celibately even if married, or better, to dissolve their marriages and commit to celibacy completely. Some do. They abandon spouses and children to join the celibate order Conrad is creating. By 1740, the community has grown to about 80 people. They have built several buildings. A large meeting house called the Saal, dormitories for the celibate brothers and sisters, a print shop, workshops, They call the settlement Ephrata, after the biblical town. Conrad becomes known as Father Friedsam, peaceful father. Though there is nothing peaceful about the regime he imposes. The brothers and sisters are divided, completely separate, men in one building, women in another. They do not speak to each other, do not interact except during worship. The celibate sisters are called the Roses of Sharon. They wear white habits, keep their heads covered, live in silence most of the day. The daily schedule is brutal. Rise at 5 a.m., morning prayers. Work until noon, one meal, more work until evening prayers, then the midnight vigil, up at midnight, singing hymns until 2 a.m. back to the wooden benches, up again at 5, repeat forever. The singing is extraordinary. Conrad develops a unique musical system, 7-part harmony, complex compositions. The midnight hymns can be heard for miles in the quiet forest. Beautiful, haunting, unlike anything in colonial America. Conrad claims the music is divinely inspired, that angels teach him the melodies in visions. The community also produces illuminated manuscripts, fracture, elaborate calligraphy and illustrations, religious texts, hymn books, certificates. The artistry is exceptional, some of the finest examples of manuscript illumination in early America. The work is done by celibate brothers and sisters who spend hours creating single pages, devotional acts, prayers made visible, but the physical toll is devastating. The lack of sleep, the poor nutrition, the constant work, the wooden benches, people's health deteriorates. Backs become permanently damaged from sleeping sitting up. Malnutrition causes disease. Exhaustion leads to accidents and injuries. Some die young. Their bodies simply cannot sustain the abuse. Conrad is unmoved by the suffering. He sees it as necessary, essential. The flesh must be broken. The body must be conquered. Death is release. Those who die have achieved victory over the flesh. They should be celebrated, not mourned. Their suffering has earned them eternal reward. Visitors to Ephrata are shocked. These other religious communities practice discipline and simplicity, but nothing like this. The Quakers live simply, but they sleep in beds. The Mennonites work hard, but they eat adequately. The Moravians emphasize devotion, but do not torture their bodies. Ephrata is unique in its extremism. Some visitors are impressed. They see holiness, dedication, people so committed to God that they sacrifice everything. The singing moves them, the artwork inspires them, the devotion challenges them. They return home questioning their own comfort and compromise. Others are horrified. They see cruelty, mental illness, a dangerous cult led by a charismatic madman. They write letters warning people to stay away. They spread rumors that Conrad is a fraud, that he lives comfortably while his followers suffer, that he has sexual relationships with the sisters despite preaching celibacy. These rumors are never proven, but they persist. The truth about Conrad is complicated. He does sleep on a wooden bench like the brothers. He does fast and pray. He does work constantly. He is not a hypocrite in that sense. He imposes on himself the same regime he demands of others. But he also has absolute authority, total control. No one can question him. No one can challenge his revelations. He is the prophet, the voice of God. And this power corrupts even a sincere ascetic. Conrad's theology evolves in stranger directions. He becomes convinced that the seventh-day Sabbath Saturday is essential, that worshipping on Sunday is apostasy, that the true church must observe Saturday as the Sabbath. This creates conflict with other Christians who see Saturday observance as Jewish, as legalistic, as unnecessary. Conrad does not care. He believes God has revealed this truth to him. The community begins observing Saturday Sabbath, refusing to work, devoting the entire day to worship. This marks them as even more radical, even more separate from mainstream Christianity. He also develops elaborate theories about the millennium. He calculates dates, interprets prophecies in Daniel and Revelation, becomes convinced that Christ's return is imminent, that Ephrata is the New Jerusalem, that the celibate brothers and sisters are the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation, that they will reign with Christ when he returns. This apocalyptic expectation intensifies the community's practices. If Christ is returning soon, wait, if the world is ending, why worry about comfort? Why preserve your health? Why hold back from total commitment? Give everything now. Suffer completely. Earn your place in the coming kingdom. Years pass. The community reaches its peak around 150 members in the 1750s. But problems are emerging. The extreme practices cannot be sustained indefinitely. Bodies break down. People leave. Some die. Recruitment slows. Fewer new members join as word spreads about the harshness of life at Ephrata. Conrad ages. He was born in 1703. By the 1750s he is in his 50s. The years of fasting and sleep deprivation are taking their toll. He becomes more erratic, more authoritarian, more convinced of his own divine inspiration. But he's also weakening physically. The regime that he claimed would free the spirit is destroying his body. The community faces external pressures as well. The French and Indian War brings violence to Pennsylvania. Ephrata is in a frontier area, vulnerable to attack. In 1758, British forces retreating from Fort Duquesne bring hundreds of wounded soldiers. They need shelter, medical care, food. The Ephrata community opens its doors, takes in the wounded, provides care. This is remarkable because the community's principles include pacifism. They oppose war, refuse military service, yet they care for wounded soldiers, treating friend and enemy alike. Many soldiers die at Ephrata, are buried there. The community's commitment to mercy overrides their isolationism. But the experience changes things. The outside world has entered Ephrata. The isolation is broken. The bubble is punctured. Members see soldiers, talk to them, hear about the wider world. Some begin questioning, wondering if the extreme practices are really necessary. If there might be other ways to serve God. Conrad Beissel dies in 1768. He is 65 years old, worn out, exhausted. His body destroyed by decades of abuse. He is buried at Ephrata. His grave is simple, unmarked initially, as he wanted. No monuments to the flesh, no celebration of the person, only the spirit matters. His death creates a leadership crisis. Conrad was the community, his revelations, his authority, his vision. Without him, what is Ephrata? Who can claim to speak for God? Who can maintain the discipline and commitment? Peter Miller takes over leadership. Miller was one of the first members. A former Reformed pastor who joined Conrad in the early days. He is educated, capable, but he lacks Conrad's charisma, his claim to divine revelation. Miller is an administrator, not a prophet. Under Miller's leadership, the community begins to soften, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The sleeping benches remain, the celibacy remains, the basic structure remains, but the intensity decreases. The midnight vigils become less frequent, the fasting less extreme, the discipline less harsh. Miller dies in 1796. The community is already declining. Membership has fallen to about 30, mostly elderly people who have spent their entire adult lives at Ephrata. No young people are joining. The extreme practices are no longer attractive. The apocalyptic expectations have faded. Christ did not return. The millennium did not come. The prophecies failed. The community continues in diminished form through the early 19th century, more like a normal religious community than the radical experiment it had been. People sleep in beds, eat regular meals, work normal hours, the celibate orders dissolve, people marry, have children. The distinctive practices that defined Ephrata disappear. By 1814, only a handful of members remain. The buildings are deteriorating, the print shop is closed, the illuminated manuscripts are scattered, some sold, some lost. The midnight hymns are silent. The White Road brothers and sisters are gone. Just a few elderly people maintaining buildings that are too large for them. The last member dies in the 1850s. Ephrata as a religious community ceases to exist. The property is sold. Some buildings are demolished, others are used for secular purposes. The experiment is over, failed, forgotten by most people. But the influence of Ephrata persisted in unexpected ways. The Seventh-day Baptists in America were influenced by Conrad's Saturday Sabbath teaching. This Saturday Sabbath idea spread, eventually contributing to the formation of Seventh-day Adventism in the mid-19th century. Ellen White and the Adventist pioneers were aware of Saturday Sabbath groups. Ephrata helped normalize the practice in America. The musical traditions influenced American hymnody, the 7-part harmony, the complex compositions, the emphasis on congregational singing. These elements spread beyond Ephrata, influenced other German communities, contributed to the development of American sacred music. The illuminated manuscripts influenced American folk art. Fracta became a recognized art form, practiced by Pennsylvania Germans for generations. The techniques and styles developed at Ephrata spread. The beautiful calligraphy and illustrations became part of Pennsylvania German cultural identity. The print shop at Ephrata was one of the first in the colonies to print in German. They published religious texts, hymnals, books that served the German immigrant community. Christopher Sauer II worked with Ephrata. His press became one of the most important German-language presses in colonial America. He printed the first German Bible in America in 1743. Ephrata's printing tradition contributed to German cultural preservation. But perhaps the most significant legacy was darker. Dundee Ephrata demonstrated how far religious radicalism could go in America, how extreme practices could develop when charismatic leaders claimed divine authority, how intelligent people could be convinced to destroy their bodies in pursuit of spiritual goals, how religious freedom could enable abuse as well as devotion. The story of Ephrata raises uncomfortable questions about religious communities. Where is the line between devotion and self-destruction? Between spiritual discipline and physical abuse? Between following a prophet and joining a cult? At what point does freedom of religion protect practices that are harmful? Modern scholars struggle with how to categorize Ephrata. It was not a cult in the modern sense. There was no financial fraud, no false prophecies used to control people, no sexual exploitation despite the rumors. People were free to leave. Many did. The suffering was voluntary, consensual. People chose the wooden benches, chose the fasting, chose the celibacy. But it was also harmful, objectively harmful. People's bodies were damaged, their health destroyed, Some died young from the practices. The psychological impact was significant. The isolation, the sleep deprivation, the constant self-denial. This was not healthy, not sustainable, not good for human beings regardless of spiritual intentions. The celibacy teaching destroyed families. Men and women who were married separated. Children were abandoned. Husbands and wives chose Conrad's community over their spouses and children. This caused real suffering, real damage. To the people left behind, to the children who grew up without parents, the spiritual pursuits of some caused pain for many. Conrad Beissel himself remains an enigma. Was he a sincere mystic who believed his own revelations, or a manipulative leader who used religion to gain power? The evidence suggests both. He genuinely believed in his mission, genuinely sought God, genuinely thought the extreme practices were necessary. He was not a conscious fraud. But he also enjoyed his authority, demanded absolute obedience, tolerated no criticism, created a system where he was unaccountable, where his word was law, where his revelations could not be questioned. This is dangerous, even if the intentions are pure, even if the leader is sincere. Absolute power corrupts, even in religious communities, especially in religious communities. The brothers and sisters who joined Ephrata were not weak or stupid. They were seekers, people hungry for meaning and purpose, disillusioned with formal religion, wanting something real, something demanding, something that felt authentic in a world of compromise and corruption. They found that at Ephrata. But at what cost? They traded one kind of suffering for another, traded the emptiness of conventional life for the physical destruction of extreme asceticism. Neither option was good. Both were damaging, just in different ways. Some former members spoke positively about their time at Ephrata. They valued the community, the devotion, the sense of purpose. They believed the suffering had spiritual benefit, that it had brought them closer to God, that they had experienced something profound that people living comfortable lives never would. Others regretted it, saw it as wasted years, damaged bodies for nothing, false promises, misguided theology. They left bitter, angry, feeling deceived even if Conrad believed his own teachings, because belief does not justify harm, sincerity does not excuse damage. The physical remains of Ephrata tell the story silently. The buildings that survive are museums now. The sleep hall with its narrow benches is preserved. Visitors can see where the brothers slept, can imagine the discomfort, the suffering, can try to understand why anyone would choose this. The saal, the meeting house, still stands, the room where they sang those midnight hymns, where Conrad preached his revelations, where hundreds of people gathered seeking God and found wooden benches and starvation diets and sleep deprivation. The illuminated manuscripts are scattered in museums, beautiful, intricate, created by exhausted hands, works of art produced under conditions of deliberate suffering, the beauty and the pain inseparable. You cannot appreciate the art without acknowledging the abuse. The cemetery holds the bodies, simple graves, no elaborate markers, the brothers and sisters who died at Ephrata, some young, some old, all committed, all suffering, all believing they were serving God, their bodies destroyed by practices they thought were holy. Walking through Ephrata today, you feel the strangeness, the disconnect between the beautiful buildings and the harsh practices, between the exquisite art and the brutal regime, between the sincere faith and the obvious harm. It does not make sense. cannot make sense to modern sensibilities. But that is the point. Ephrata was not modern, not rational, not based on principles we recognize or values we share. It was medieval mysticism transplanted to Pennsylvania, German pietism taken to logical extremes, apocalyptic expectation turned into physical practice, a window into a religious worldview so foreign to us that it seems incomprehensible. Yet aspects of Ephrata's approach persist in modern religious movements, megachurches that demand total commitment, religious communities that practice extreme discipline, leaders who claim divine authority, followers who sacrifice health and relationships for spiritual goals. The specific practices are different. No wooden benches, no midnight vigils. But the underlying dynamics are similar. The appeal of Ephrata was the appeal of all radical religious movements. Certainty, purpose, community, meaning. Escape from the compromises and corruptions of ordinary life. A chance to be part of something greater, to serve God completely, to live for something beyond yourself. These are legitimate desires, human needs. The problem is not wanting meaning and purpose. The problem is what people are willing to do to achieve them, what they are willing to sacrifice, what they are willing to endure, and what leaders are willing to demand. Ephrata represents an extreme, but extremes reveal patterns, show us dynamics that exist in milder forms elsewhere. Help us understand how religious communities can become harmful even when everyone is sincere, even when no one is consciously deceiving, even when the stated goals are spiritual and noble. The lessons of Ephrata are relevant today. Question charismatic leaders, especially those who claim divine revelation. Be suspicious of practices that harm the body in the name of spiritual growth. Recognize that sincerity does not justify damage. That belief does not excuse abuse. That religious freedom has limits when it enables harm. But also recognize the human hunger that drove people to Ephrata. The desire for something real, something demanding, something worth sacrificing for. This desire is not wrong. The question is how to channel it, how to pursue meaning and purpose without destroying yourself, how to build communities of devotion without enabling abuse. Ephrata failed. By any reasonable measure, the community collapsed, the practices were unsustainable, the theology was flawed, the prophecies failed, the suffering achieved nothing except more suffering. The experiment ended in abandoned buildings and scattered survivors. But for a few decades in the 18th century it existed. A radical religious community in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Hundreds of people choosing wooden benches and fasting and celibacy, creating extraordinary music and art, living entirely for spiritual goals, rejecting everything the world valued, pursuing God with total commitment and zero compromise. Strange, incomprehensible, disturbing, fascinating, a monument to human religious impulse, to the desire for transcendence, to the willingness to suffer for belief, to the dangers of charismatic authority, to the limits of the body, to the power of community, to the failure of certainty. The Ephrata Cloister, where German mystics built a monastery in Pennsylvania, where hundreds slept on wooden benches, where midnight hymns echoed through the forest, where celibate brothers and sisters created illuminated manuscripts while starving themselves, where Conrad Beissel claimed to speak for God and people believed him. All of it gone now, except the buildings, the manuscripts, the graves, the memory, the warning about what happens when religious certainty meets absolute authority. when spiritual hunger overcomes physical wisdom, when the pursuit of God leads to the destruction of the body, when freedom of religion enables extremism, when sincere belief causes genuine harm, all of it gone now, except the buildings, the manuscripts, the graves, the memory, the warning, about what happens when religious certainty meets absolute authority, when spiritual hunger overcomes physical wisdom, when the pursuit of God leads to the destruction of the body, when freedom of religion enables extremism, when sincere belief causes genuine harm. But to truly understand the strangeness of Ephrata, you need to understand the world that created it. The religious fever gripping Europe and colonial America in the early 18th century, the movements and ideas that made sleeping on wooden benches seem not just reasonable, but spiritually necessary. Germany in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was a cauldron of religious experimentation. The Protestant Reformation had shattered religious unity a century earlier. Now dozens of movements competed, each claiming to have recovered true Christianity, each offering salvation through different practices and beliefs. The mainstream Lutheran and Reformed churches dominated officially. State churches, supported by princes and governments. But many people found them spiritually dead, were too formal, too intellectual, too compromised with worldly power. They wanted something deeper, more experiential, more demanding. This hunger produced Pietism, a movement within Protestantism emphasizing personal conversion, Bible study, holy living, and emotional religious experience. Pietists gathered in small groups, conventicles. They prayed together, studied scripture, shared their spiritual experiences. They criticized the established churches for coldness and corruption. Some Pietists went further. They rejected infant baptism, refused oaths and military service, separated from the state churches entirely. These became the radical Pietists, groups like the Mennonites, the Schwenkfelders, the Brethren, small communities of believers trying to recreate New Testament Christianity, and some went even further, into mysticism. Medieval mysticism had never completely died. Books by mystics like Jakob Böhme, Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler circulated in German lands. They taught about inner light, divine wisdom dwelling within the soul, direct experience of God without need for institutional mediation. These ideas were dangerous. The established churches condemned mysticism as heresy, as leading to spiritual pride and delusion, as undermining institutional authority. But for people hungry for direct experience of the divine, mysticism was intoxicating. It promised what formal religion could not deliver: personal encounter with God, transformation, illumination. Conrad Beissel absorbed all of this. Pietism gave him the framework of personal devotion and separation from worldly corruption. A radical pietism taught him to reject infant baptism and established churches. Mysticism gave him the language of inner light and divine wisdom. And his own experiences in the wilderness added layers of apocalyptic expectation and extreme asceticism. When Conrad gathered followers at Ephrata, he drew from this entire tradition, but he also innovated, added his own revelations, created practices more extreme than anything his predecessors had advocated. The wooden benches were not traditional pietist practice. The midnight vigils were not standard mysticism. The complete celibacy was not typical of radical pietists. Conrad was creating something new, synthesizing multiple traditions into a unique and extreme religious experiment. And he had the charisma to convince people to join him. to abandon comfortable lives for wooden benches and starvation. The people who joined Ephrata were not random. They fit a pattern. Most were German immigrants, first generation. They had crossed the Atlantic seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity. They had left behind everything familiar: families, communities, the culture they had known. In Pennsylvania they faced a new world, strange language, different customs, vast wilderness. Many struggled, economically, socially, spiritually. The churches available in Pennsylvania were not like the churches they had known in Germany. Even the German churches felt different, Americanized, compromised. These dislocated, searching people were vulnerable to Conrad's message. He offered certainty in a world of confusion, community in a world of isolation, a purpose in a world of meaningless survival, and he demanded total commitment, no half measures, no compromise, all or nothing. This appealed to people who had already given up everything to come to America. They had already proven their willingness to sacrifice, to take extreme risks, to leave behind comfort and security. Joining Ephrata was just one more step in a journey they had already begun. The early members included Johann Peter Miller, who became Conrad's right-hand man and eventual successor. Miller had been a reformed pastor in Germany, educated, cultured. He gave up his position and prospects to join Conrad in the wilderness. This was not ignorance or stupidity. This was a considered choice by an intelligent man. There was also Israel Eckelin and his brothers. The Eckelins were from a well-off family. They had resources. Options. They chose Ephrata, chose the wooden benches. For years they were devoted followers. Later they would have conflicts with Conrad and leave. But initially they were true believers. Among the women, Sister Anastasia was notable. She had been married, had children. She left her family to join the Roses of Sharon, became one of the leaders of the celibate sisterhood, devoted the rest of her life to the community. Her children grew up without their mother. She believed this was God's will. That spiritual calling superseded maternal duty. These were not weak people, not desperate people with no options. They were people who believed, who wanted something more than ordinary life offered, who were willing to pay any price for what they understood as truth. The daily life at Ephrata was structured around breaking the flesh, not every practice designed to weaken the body and strengthen the spirit. The midnight vigils were crucial. Sleep deprivation has profound effects. It creates altered states of consciousness, hallucinations, heightened emotional sensitivity, makes people suggestible, compliant. Conrad knew this, whether consciously or intuitively. The midnight singing was not just worship, it was a technique, waking people from deep sleep, making them sing complex harmonies for 2 hours, then allowing 2 more hours of uncomfortable sleep before morning prayers. This kept people in a constant state of exhaustion and altered consciousness. The fasting had similar effects. Chronic malnutrition affects the brain, reduces critical thinking, increases emotional volatility, makes mystical experiences more likely. And fasting has been used by religious practitioners for millennia precisely because it produces altered states that feel spiritual. This celibacy served multiple purposes. Theologically, Conrad taught that sexual desire was the deepest form of bondage to the flesh, that conquering it was essential for spiritual advancement. But celibacy also prevented the formation of family units that might compete with loyalty to Conrad and the community. If members married and had children, their primary loyalty would shift to their families. They would put children's needs first. would prioritize family survival over community demands, would resist practices that harmed their spouses or children. Celibacy eliminated these competing loyalties, made the community the only family, made Conrad the only father. The physical arrangements reinforced this. The sleep hall where the brothers lived was communal. No privacy, no personal space, constant surveillance. If someone struggled with the practices, others would notice, would apply pressure, would report to Conrad. Individual resistance was nearly impossible. The sisters' quarters were the same, communal sleeping, constant oversight. The Roses of Sharon wore identical white habits, covered their hair, lived in silence most of the day. Their individual identities were suppressed. They became interchangeable units in the collective. This was intentional. The self was the enemy. Personal identity had to be erased. The work was equally important. 12-hour days of physical labor, farming, construction, printing, manuscript illumination. The work served practical purposes. Ephrata needed food and income. But it also served to exhaust people, to leave them too tired to think critically, too exhausted to resist. Yet despite the harshness, Ephrata produced extraordinary cultural achievements. The music was genuinely innovative. Conrad developed a unique system of composition. 7-part harmony was extremely complex for its time. Most colonial music was much simpler. Unison singing or at most 4 parts. Conrad claimed angels taught him the melodies in visions. Whether this was genuine mystical experience or creative self-deception is unknowable, but the results were real. The hymns were beautiful, complex, moving. People who heard the midnight singing from miles away described it as ethereal, otherworldly. The Ephrata hymnal, printed in 1747, contained over 700 hymns, many composed by Conrad, yet others by members of the community. The musical notation was Conrad's own invention, different from standard European notation. This made the music almost impossible for outsiders to perform, kept it within the community, added to the sense of mystery and uniqueness. The illuminated manuscripts were equally impressive. The fracta produced at Ephrata is considered among the finest in early America. Elaborate calligraphy, intricate illustrations, religious texts and certificates decorated with astonishing detail and beauty. Creating these manuscripts was a spiritual discipline. Brothers and sisters would spend hours on single letters, days on a single page. The work required patience, precision, concentration. It was a form of meditation, a way of focusing the mind entirely on a devotional task. The beauty of the final product was secondary to the spiritual benefit of the process. But it is also true that beautiful products attracted attention and brought income. Ephrata sold manuscripts and printed materials. This provided revenue that helped sustain the community. The cultural production served both spiritual and economic purposes. The print shop was significant. Ephrata was one of the first printing operations in Pennsylvania to focus on German language materials. They printed religious texts, hymnals, books of theology and mysticism. These served the broader German immigrant community, helped preserve German language and culture in America. Christopher Sauer, one of the most important printers in colonial America, had connections to Ephrata. He printed the first German Bible in America in 1743. This Bible served German communities throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. Ephrata's printing tradition contributed to this cultural preservation. But the cultural achievements came at tremendous human cost. The people creating these beautiful works were suffering, malnourished, sleep-deprived, physically damaged. The manuscripts are beautiful, but they are also testaments to exploitation. Art created through suffering, beauty purchased with broken bodies. The celibacy teaching caused particular damage. Conrad did not simply teach that celibacy was spiritually superior, he actively broke up marriages, convinced married couples to separate, to live celibately even while married, or to dissolve their marriages entirely and join the celibate orders. Families were destroyed, children lost parents, spouses were abandoned, all in the name of spiritual advancement. And Conrad faced no accountability for this damage. He claimed divine authority, said God had revealed these truths to him. Who could argue with God? Some people resisted, refused to separate from their spouses. These people were pushed out, made to feel that they were spiritually weak, that they were choosing flesh over spirit. Some left Ephrata, returned to normal life. Others stayed but lived in a secondary status. Married members who were tolerated but never fully accepted. The hierarchy at Ephrata was clear. The celibate brothers and sisters were the spiritual elite, the truly committed, the ones who had conquered the flesh. Married members were second class, still part of the community but not part of the inner circle. Or not part of the 144,000 who would reign with Christ. This created resentment and division. Married members felt judged and excluded. They contributed labor and resources but were treated as spiritual inferiors. Some eventually left. Others endured the condescension, hoping that their presence at Ephrata, even in diminished status, would earn them salvation. The apocalyptic expectations intensified everything. Conrad taught that Christ's return was imminent, that the millennium was approaching, that Ephrata was the new Jerusalem where the faithful would gather before the end. This created urgency, desperation even. If the world is ending soon, suffering does not matter. Your body's health does not matter. Relationships do not matter. Only spiritual readiness matters. It will only be encountered among the faithful when Christ returns. This thinking justified any sacrifice, any hardship, any abandonment of normal human concerns. Conrad calculated dates, interpreted prophecies, found patterns in Daniel and Revelation that pointed to specific years. When those years passed without Christ returning, he recalculated, found new patterns, new interpretations. The prophecies were always just about to be fulfilled. The end was always imminent, just a little longer, just a little more sacrifice. This is the pattern of all apocalyptic movements. Failed prophecies do not destroy belief. They are explained away, reinterpreted, the date is adjusted, the timeline is revised, and followers accept the explanations because they have invested too much to admit it was all wrong. Walking away means admitting they destroyed their bodies for nothing. Easier to believe, easier to adjust the timeline than face reality. The outside world watched Ephrata with a mixture of fascination and horror. Visitors came, some looking for spiritual enlightenment, others just curious about the strange community in the wilderness. Conrad welcomed visitors, showed them around, explained his theology, tried to impress them with the community's devotion and achievements. Some visitors were impressed. They saw holiness, dedication, people living their faith without compromise. The midnight hymns moved them. The beautiful manuscripts inspired them. The community's charitable work during the French and Indian War demonstrated genuine Christian love. These visitors wrote positive accounts, helped spread Ephrata's reputation. Then others were disturbed. They saw abuse, saw people destroying their health for dubious theology, saw Conrad wielding absolute power without accountability, saw families broken and children abandoned. These visitors wrote warning letters, published critical accounts, tried to prevent others from joining. The positive and negative accounts both circulated. Both influenced how people perceived Ephrata. Some were attracted by the positive accounts, joined seeking the holiness they heard about. Others were deterred by the negative accounts, warned their families and communities to stay away. Benjamin Franklin visited Ephrata. He was impressed by the print shop, by the community's industry. He had business dealings with Ephrata, bought paper from them, sold them printing supplies. Franklin was not religious himself, but he respected religious communities that were productive and self-sufficient. He wrote about Ephrata in generally positive terms, but Franklin did not sleep on the wooden benches, did not fast with them, did not join the midnight vigils. He observed from outside, appreciated the community's accomplishments without experiencing their practices. His approval was based on incomplete knowledge. Count Zinzendorf, leader of the Moravian Church, also visited. He tried to convince Conrad to merge with the Moravians. Zinzendorf saw potential in Conrad's followers, wanted to bring them into the Moravian fold, but Conrad refused. He believed his revelations were unique, that Ephrata's mission was separate from any existing denomination. The two leaders parted without agreement. As the 1750s progressed, cracks began appearing in Ephrata's foundation. The extreme practices were unsustainable. People's bodies were breaking down. Long-term sleep deprivation causes permanent damage. Chronic malnutrition weakens immune systems, makes people vulnerable to disease. Many members were sick, some dying young. The Israel Echelin brothers, who'd been among Conrad's closest associates, broke with him. The conflict was partly theological, partly personal, partly about Conrad's authoritarian leadership. The Echelins accused Conrad of hypocrisy, of living more comfortably than other members while demanding their suffering. Conrad expelled them, declared them apostates. This split shook the community. The Echelins had been leaders, respected members. If they could become disillusioned and leave, who else might question? Who else might doubt? Conrad tightened control, increased surveillance, made loyalty tests more stringent. But this created more resentment, more hidden doubts. The French and Indian War brought the outside world crashing into Ephrata's isolation. In 1758, British forces retreating from Fort Duquesne brought hundreds of wounded soldiers. They needed shelter and medical care. The nearest facility capable of handling so many wounded was Ephrata. The community faced a choice: turn away the wounded and maintain their isolation, or open their doors and contaminate their spiritual purity with the world's violence. Conrad chose compassion. Ephrata took in the wounded, transformed buildings into hospitals, devoted resources to caring for soldiers. This decision was remarkable given Ephrata's pacifist principles. They opposed war, refused military service, taught that violence was sinful, yet they cared for wounded soldiers, friends and enemies alike, British and French. They did not ask which side soldiers fought for, just treated their wounds. Many soldiers died at Ephrata. The community buried them, conducted funeral services, treated the dead with dignity regardless of religion or nation. This demonstrated a practical Christianity that impressed observers. Whatever else Ephrata was, it practiced genuine charity in crisis. But the experience changed the community. Members interacted with soldiers, heard stories from the outside world, saw that worldly people could be brave and honourable, that non-Ephrata Christians could be devout. The absolute certainty that only Ephrata had truth began to erode. Young people especially were affected. They had grown up isolated, told that the outside world was corrupt and evil. Now they met soldiers their own age, normal young men. Some were Christians, some were moral and decent, some showed courage and kindness. The propaganda about worldly corruption did not match reality. After the wounded soldiers left, some young members began questioning. If people outside Ephrata could be good, why was such extreme suffering necessary? If God valued compassion, why did Conrad emphasize self-denial? If Christ taught love, why did Ephrata teaching emphasize conquering the flesh? These questions were dangerous. Conrad could not answer them satisfactorily. His theology depended on maintaining clear separation between Ephrata's righteousness and the world's corruption. Contact with soldiers blurred that line. It revealed complexity and nuance that Conrad's simple dichotomy could not accommodate. Conrad Beissel died in 1768 at age 65. The official cause was exhaustion, which was accurate. Decades of sleeping on wooden benches, decades of fasting, decades of sleep deprivation. His body simply gave out. The practices he had imposed on others destroyed him too. His death was treated as martyrdom, the ultimate conquest of flesh. He had given everything to God, sacrificed his health and comfort, died in service to the divine. This was how followers chose to interpret it. Not that his practices were harmful and killed him prematurely, but that his devotion was so complete it consumed his mortal frame. He was buried at Ephrata, simple grave, no monument initially, as he had wanted. The spirit matters, not the body. The person is temporary, the work eternal. These were his teachings, applied to his own death. But his death created immediate problems. Conrad had been Ephrata. His revelations, his authority, his vision. He had never designated a successor, had not created a structure for transferring power. He probably assumed Christ would return before he died, that the millennium would come, that succession planning was unnecessary. Peter Miller took control. He had been Conrad's associate for decades, understood the community, was respected by members. But Miller was not a prophet. He could not claim divine revelations, could not command the absolute authority Conrad had wielded. Under Miller's leadership, Ephrata began softening. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually the extreme practices lessened. The midnight vigils became less frequent, the fasting less severe, the discipline less harsh. Miller was an administrator, a maintainer, not a visionary, not a reformer, just someone trying to keep the community functioning. But the problem was deeper than leadership style. The entire system had been built around Conrad's charisma and claimed divine authority. Without him, why follow these extreme practices? If the apocalypse Conrad predicted did not come, why keep suffering? If the prophecies failed, why trust the theology? Membership declined. Young people left, married and settled in normal communities. Older members stayed. They had invested their entire lives at Ephrata, had nowhere else to go. But they were aging, dying, not being replaced by new recruits. The celibate orders especially declined. Few young people wanted celibacy. The mysticism that had attracted an earlier generation no longer appealed. American culture was changing. becoming more pragmatic, more focused on economic opportunity and nation building, less interested in medieval mysticism and apocalyptic speculation. By the time Miller died in 1796, Ephrata was already a shadow of its former self. Membership had fallen from its peak of 150 to about 30. Buildings were deteriorating, resources were scarce, the spiritual intensity had evaporated. The 19th century saw continued decline. The few remaining members modified practices further, slept in beds, ate normal meals, maintained some communal aspects but functioned more like a normal pietist community than the radical experiment Conrad had created. The celibate orders dissolved entirely. People married, or had families, raised children in more conventional ways. The distinctive white robes disappeared. The midnight hymns stopped. The illuminated manuscripts were no longer produced. Everything that had made Ephrata unique was abandoned. The community limped along into the 1850s. By then only a handful of elderly people remained, living in buildings too large for them, maintaining traditions they barely remembered the meaning of. The last member died in the 1850s. The experiment ended. Over 100 years after Conrad first settled in the wilderness, the property was sold, some buildings demolished, others converted to secular uses. The sleep hall, the salle, the sisters' quarters, these were eventually preserved, turned into museums, but that came later. Initially they were just abandoned structures, reminders of a failed experiment. But Ephrata's influence outlasted the community itself. The Saturday Sabbath teaching influenced American religious culture. The Seventh-day Baptists were aware of Ephrata's Sabbath observance. So were the founders of Seventh-day Adventism. Ellen White and the early Adventist pioneers knew about Saturday Sabbath groups. Ephrata helped normalize the practice. The musical innovations influenced American hymnody, 7-part harmony, complex compositions, emphasis on congregational singing. These elements spread beyond Ephrata, influenced other German communities, became part of American sacred music tradition. You can trace lines from Ephrata's music to later American hymn writing. The illuminated manuscripts influenced Pennsylvania German folk art. Fraktur became a recognized art form, practiced by Pennsylvania Germans for generations. Birth certificates, wedding certificates, religious texts, all decorated with calligraphy and illustrations derived from techniques developed at Ephrata. The printing tradition contributed to German cultural preservation in America. Ephrata's print shop published German-language materials at a time when German immigrants needed them desperately. Helped maintain German language and culture. This cultural preservation influenced American immigration patterns and ethnic identity development. But perhaps most significantly, Ephrata demonstrated the potential and the peril of religious radicalism in America. Religious freedom enabled Ephrata to exist, protected Conrad's right to establish his community, protected members' right to join voluntarily and follow extreme practices. This freedom was essential, noble even. But freedom also enabled harm. People destroyed their health. Families were broken. Children were abandoned, all protected by religious liberty. Where is the line? When does freedom of religion become protection for abuse? When should the state intervene? When should it stay out? These questions remain relevant. Modern religious communities still practice extreme discipline, still demand total commitment, still isolate members, still use sleep deprivation and fasting and social pressure. The specific practices differ, but the dynamics are similar. Ephrata shows us that sincere belief does not prevent harm, that consensual participation does not mean practices are healthy, that religious freedom has limits when it enables damage to vulnerable people. These lessons are uncomfortable. Just challenge our assumptions about autonomy and liberty in religion. The physical remains of Ephrata force us to confront these questions. The wooden benches are still there, narrow, uncomfortable. You can sit on them. Feel how impossible sleeping on them would be. Imagine doing it every night, for years, for decades. Your body cries out against it, but they did it, voluntarily, believing it was God's will, the saal where they sang. You can stand in that room. Imagine it filled with white-robed figures. Midnight, exhausted from work and lack of sleep, singing complex harmonies, believing they were communing with angels, expecting Christ to return any day, living entirely for something beyond the physical world, the cemetery where they are buried, simple graves, many marked, many not. Bodies worn out by practices they believed would free their spirits. Did they achieve enlightenment, experience God, find what they sought, or did they simply suffer and die for false promises? We cannot know, they cannot tell us. Walking through Ephrata today, the strangeness remains, the disconnect between the beautiful architecture and the harsh regime, between the exquisite manuscripts and the suffering that created them, between sincere faith and obvious harm. It resists easy judgment, defies simple categories. Ephrata was not a straightforward cult, no financial fraud, no false prophecies used for manipulation, no sexual exploitation despite rumours. People could leave, many did. The suffering was chosen, consensual, real. But it was also harmful, objectively harmful. Bodies were damaged, health destroyed, families broken. The spiritual goals may have been sincere, but the methods were destructive. The results were suffering. Whatever transcendence individuals may have experienced cannot justify the physical damage to hundreds of people. Conrad Beissel was not a simple charlatan. He believed his own teachings, practiced what he preached, suffered the same privations he imposed on others. He was not consciously deceiving, was not enriching himself at followers' expense, was not sexually exploiting members. But he was still dangerous. His certainty, his claim to divine revelation, his demand for absolute obedience, his inability to question his own practices, these created conditions where harm flourished, where people destroyed themselves believing it was God's will, where abuse was sacralized as spiritual discipline. The members who joined were not weak or stupid. They were seekers, hungry for meaning, disillusioned with conventional religion, wanting something real and demanding. These are legitimate desires. The problem is not wanting transcendence. The problem is what people will do to achieve it. Ephrata represents an extreme, but extremes reveal patterns, show dynamics that exist in milder forms elsewhere. Help us understand how religious communities can become harmful even when everyone is sincere, even when intentions are pure, even when stated goals are spiritual and noble. The lessons are clear. Question charismatic leaders, especially those claiming divine revelation. Be suspicious of practices that harm the body. Recognize that sincerity does not justify damage, that consent does not mean practices are healthy, that religious freedom has limits when it enables harm, but also recognize the human hunger that drove people to Ephrata, the desire for meaning, for purpose, for community, for transcendence. These desires are not wrong, are not pathological, are deeply human. The question is how to fulfill them without destroying people in the process. Ephrata failed. by any reasonable measure. The community collapsed, the practices were unsustainable, the prophecies failed, the suffering achieved nothing except more suffering. Bodies were broken, families destroyed, lives wasted on false promises and failed expectations. But for a few decades in the 18th century it existed, a radical experiment in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Hundreds of people choosing suffering, creating beauty, pursuing God with total commitment, living entirely for spiritual goals, rejecting everything the world valued. Strange, disturbing, fascinating, incomprehensible, a monument to human religious impulse, to the desire for transcendence, to the willingness to suffer for belief, to the dangers of absolute authority, to the limits of the body, to the power of faith, to the tragedy of certainty. The Ephrata Cloister, where German mystics built a monastery in Pennsylvania, where hundreds slept on wooden benches, where midnight hymns echoed through forests, where celibate brothers and sisters created illuminated manuscripts while starving themselves, where Conrad Beissel claimed divine revelation, and people believed him, where beauty and suffering were inseparable, where faith and harm were intertwined. All of it gone now, except the buildings, the manuscripts, the graves, the memory, the warning. That is the story of Ephrata. Strange, extreme, uniquely American. A religious experiment that shows both the power and the peril of faith unrestrained. The beauty and the danger of communities built on absolute commitment. The achievement and the tragedy of people willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed was truth. The wooden benches remain, silent testimony, to suffering chosen freely, to devotion without limits, to the human capacity for both extraordinary dedication and extraordinary self-destruction, to a world we can barely imagine, to beliefs we cannot share, to practices we cannot endorse, to a community that existed briefly and then disappeared, leaving only questions, warnings, and the strange, haunting beauty of their faith made visible.